Hello students, and welcome to the last lecture of the series on the human nervous system. This is from chapter 5 in the book, but most of the useful information can be found in the slideshow. So to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about in this lecture, I'm going to start out by discussing neurons. Neurons are the most important cells that constitute the nervous system. And we'll talk about these special cells by themselves and what the various components are. So for instance, they have a body. They have some kind of things that stick out from the body called dendrites. And then they have one very long appendage called an axon, a very long arm, if you will, called an axon. And the axon is what they use to transmit signals throughout the body over long distances. So the body of a neuron is the same size as any other cell, approximately 10 microns in diameter. But the axon can be many millimeters in length. The axon can be thousands or even millions of times longer than the cell. And so the axon kind of acts like a little electrical wire or a telephone cable or an optics cable that transmits signals around the body over long distances. And then typically what happens is one neuron will stimulate another neuron, and the stimulation will take place as the end of the axon of one neuron will spray a chemical onto the other neuron, which will stimulate it. And the space between neurons, the space between the end of the axon of one neuron and the body or the dendrite of another neuron, this little tiny space where these chemicals are sprayed onto the adjacent neuron, that space is called a synapse, which is an important term to remember. And the chemicals that are sprayed from one cell to another are called neurotransmitters, and there are several different ones. Different types of neurons produce different neurotransmitters. And typically, when you spray a neurotransmitter onto another neuron, the other neuron will be stimulated, but usually not just with one spray. It either has to be sprayed by another neuron several times, or it has to be sprayed by several neurons at once in order to exceed a threshold for stimulation which causes that neuron to be activated. That threshold, if it's stimulated enough times by one other neuron or stimulated several times simultaneously by several neurons, that is enough to activate it. That is referred to as an action potential. Now, I mentioned the fact that the axon of a neuron is very long. Some of them are short, some of them are long. The ones that are short tend to be in the brain. So the brain is made of neurons that have very short axons. But the neurons that run from the brain and carry messages all the way out to the ends of the fingers and all the way out to the ends of the toes and things like that, they have much, much longer axons. The longest axons that you'll find are in neurons that are in the spinal cord, and some of these axons are up to a meter in length or half a meter in length, which is very long compared to the cell. But these long axons, sort of like an electrical wire, they have to be insulated if they're going to faithfully convey signals over long distances. So you know that if you have an electrical wire, it's insulated by rubber, which doesn't conduct electricity, because the goal is to keep the electricity inside the wire. And so the same thing is true for neurons that have very long axons. The axons have to be insulated not with rubber, but with a lipid called myelin. So myelin is a lipid that is wrapped around the axons, the very long axons of neurons that have very long axons and which convey messages to distant parts of the body from the brain and back. Okay, and then we have, so myelin insulation is a characteristic of neurons that have very long axons. We have two types of neurons. Basically, there are motor neurons. You need to remember the term motor neuron. A motor neuron is a neuron that controls the muscles. So you have a neuron that is located in the brain, which has a very long axon which travels down the spinal cord and out to a muscle, stimulates the muscle from the brain. That is called a motor neuron. There are other neurons, like the neurons in the eyes or the ears or the nose, that are located in distant parts of the body which convey signals from the outside world back to the brain, and we call those sensory neurons. Right? And then what is the difference between a neuron and a nerve? Well, a nerve is simply a big bundle of neurons. It's generally a big bundle that consists mostly of the axons of very long neurons. So you have a kind of like a telephone wire versus a telephone cable that runs under the ocean. You know, this technology is rapidly becoming obsolete, but in the old days they literally had telephone cables that ran under the ocean, that ran from Europe to North America, from North America to Asia. These cables were thousands of miles long, and they were composed of copper wires. It cost a fortune. It cost a fortune to lay these cables on the ocean floor. It took a lot of copper, but they were bundled, and these telephone cables that ran along the ocean floor were maybe, you know, they were maybe 10 centimeters or 20 centimeters in diameter, and they contained thousands of individually insulated copper wires. So that's kind of like what a nerve is. A nerve is a big bundle of axons from thousands and thousands of neurons. Okay, now once we finish discussing what neurons are, we'll discuss the nervous system. The nervous system is generally divided into two parts: the central nervous system, which means the brain and the spinal column, the nerves that run down the spinal cord. And the PNS stands for peripheral nervous system. The word peripheral means around the edges, close to the outside. So in this case, we're talking about if the central nervous system is the brain and the nerves that run up and down through the spinal column, the peripheral nervous system consists of the nerves that come out of the spinal column and travel to the distant parts of the body. Now, then we'll discuss the brain itself. The brain is surrounded by some membranes called meninges. So a meninge is one of the membranes. There are actually 3 layers of membranes that surround the brain, and they are collectively called the meninges. The brain itself, it uses oxygen just like any other part of the body, but the oxygen is not brought to the brain by blood cells. In fact, the brain is protected by one of these layers of membranes that prevents the blood from actually getting directly to the brain. What happens is the brain is floating in a liquid called cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebro refers to the head, spinal means the spinal cord. So both the brain and the spinal column, these neurons are not being fed oxygen by blood. They are floating in a thin layer of cerebrospinal fluid, which has the capacity to carry small amounts of oxygen. So blood cells do not actually touch the brain, which is one of the most unique parts of the human body. Every other part of the body, the blood is delivered, the oxygen is delivered to the cells through the blood. The neurons, the oxygen does not reach them directly from the blood. The oxygen is sucked out of the blood by one of the meninges called the pia mater, and the oxygen is in the cerebrospinal fluid, and so is the carbon dioxide that's released by these cells, by the neurons. Okay, so cerebrospinal fluid it's a fluid that's fairly similar to blood serum, but the blood, what's called the blood-brain barrier, which is the membranes that separate the brain from the other tissues. The blood-brain barrier prevents blood cells from actually touching the brain. Okay, so if any of you are interested, this is one of the things that makes it a little bit more difficult to fight for your body to fight brain cancer, because cancer is normally destroyed in the early stages by white blood cells, but the blood-brain barrier prevents white blood cells from getting to the brain. So what do? That's a problem. That's a problem for the body, that the white blood cells that constitute the immune system do not have access to the brain. However, the brain does have some cells that brain does have some macrophages in it, so that there is a kind of some of the cells in the brain fulfill that function. They are classified as phagocytes rather, and their job is to eat bacteria and things like that, and kind of do the best they can to keep the brain clean. All right, now we're going to talk later on about how the body is organized into bands of tissue that are called dermatones, and each dermatone, the sensory nerves that are in each dermatone of skin send messages to the brain about touch sensations on the skin. That's how you know that things are touching your skin, due to the sensory neurons that are inside the dermatones that constitute the human body. And then we'll talk about the fact that the nervous system is divided. So we've divided the nervous system into two things physically based on physical location: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. That means central means the brain and the spinal cord, the central part of the nervous system. And the peripheral means the parts that are outside of the central area. But we also divide the nervous system into two divisions based on their function. One division is called somatic nervous system, and the other is called the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is those nerves that we have control over. So when you move your arms and your legs around, you do it on purpose, and that is part of this. That is known as the somatic nervous system. So all of the nerves all of the motor neurons, for instance, all of the motor neurons that you can control consciously constitute the somatic nervous system. But you know that there are many other organs in the body that run automatically with the help of muscles. So the food is transported through the digestive system by what's called peristaltic pumping. The peristaltic pumping is made possible because smooth muscles surround the outside of the alimentary canal, and they squeeze. Those smooth muscles contract to squeeze the food through the alimentary canal, this long tube that we call the alimentary canal. Furthermore, you know that the blood vessels are surrounded by smooth muscle in the middle layer, and that smooth muscle allows the blood vessels to expand or contract. That's known as vasodilation or vasoconstriction. And we don't concentrate on that. We don't have the ability to control that. Your body does it automatically. So that is all part of what's known as the autonomic nervous system. Now, the word autonomic, if you want to distinguish between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, just remember the fact that the word autonomic sounds a little bit like automatic, doesn't it? Automatic means it happens automatically. So the autonomic nervous system functions automatically without, we don't really have the ability to control it. Okay, so we've divided the nervous system into the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system, and we've now divided it functionally into the somatic nervous system versus the autonomic nervous system based on whether we have conscious control over it. Finally, we take the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is traditionally divided into two divisions as well: the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system versus the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system refers to a bunch of functions that prepare your body to either fight or run away. It's called the fight or flight response. There are a whole bunch of nerves in the body that control reactions that are designed to make your body become prepared to fight or to run away. And we call all of those neurons collectively, all of those neurons and all of those nerves that carry out those functions, we refer to them collectively as the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And then, on the other hand, there are a bunch of nerves that control a bunch of organs in such a way as to prepare your body to rest and sleep and digest your food, the so-called rest and digest response. And all of those nerves that carry out all of those functions are classified as the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Now, we don't have any conscious control over either one of these. That's why they're called the autonomic nervous system. But they carry out these two batches or these two classes of nerves carry out very different functions in the human body. Okay, and then finally at the end we'll do some talk about pathologies of the nervous system, as we do with every one of these lectures. We'll talk about, I believe it's easier to understand how different systems of the body work if we understand what happens when they break down. So we'll talk about some things such as spinal cord injury, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's disease, and we'll get to that at the end. So let's begin with part one, the neurons. Okay, so as I said, neurons transmit signals through the human body. Neurons communicate with each other as well as with the muscles. So for instance, in the brain, on the surface of the brain, which is called the cerebral cortex, on the surface of the brain, it is composed entirely of neurons that are simply talking to each other. And then eventually they make a decision. All of those neurons talk to each other and they make a decision. And then they send a signal down the spinal column that tells your leg muscles to contract so that you can run or something like that. So neurons communicate with each other. A good example of places where neurons only communicate with each other is the brain versus communicating with muscles or sensory organs. So that would be sensory neurons or motor neurons. Okay, so the signals that are being sent between neurons are actually sent in the form of chemicals that are called neurotransmitters. And two examples of neurotransmitters that I need you to memorize are acetylcholine and serotonin. These are two of the most important neurotransmitters. Now, as it turns out, there are several different types of neurons. Every different type of neuron is capable of producing a different neurotransmitter, and then they communicate with other neurons that have the receptors for those neurotransmitters. So we talked earlier on at the beginning of the course, we talked about the fact that that cells have receptors on the surface, which is kind of like a television antenna or a satellite dish that receives signals from afar. And the signal that is sent by other cells is usually a chemical signal. It's either a protein that's sent or a hormone or a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is strictly classified as a chemical. It's not a protein or a lipid or anything like that. It's usually strictly just a chemical. Okay, so the neurotransmitters, there are several different types of neurotransmitters that are produced by several different types of neurons, and in order to receive the signal that is sent by that neurotransmitter, you have to have the appropriate types of receptors on the surface of the cell. Okay, and as I said, the neurotransmitter is basically it's sprayed or squirted onto the other cell from the end of the axon of one cell to the body or a dendrite of another cell. And the space in between the axon of one cell and the body or a dendrite of another cell is a small gap, which is called the synapse. And neurologists, people who study the nervous system, consider that word to be a very important word. So make sure that you know what a synapse is. Okay, so a synapse is just the small space between the axon of one neuron and the body or one of the dendrites of another neuron. The axon, the end of the axon, will send or spray or squirt a little bit of this chemical into the synapse, where it makes contact with the other cell and stimulates the cell, stimulates the other cell. Now, neurons, when they're talking to each other or when they're talking to muscles, they do generate a little bit of electricity, but that's just a coincidence. The actual communication that takes place between one cell and another, it takes place due to the neurotransmitters, due to the chemicals, not the electricity. These cells, neurons, they do produce electricity, but it's just a coincidence. Okay, so you've heard of the fact that we have things like electric eels. These are these aquatic creatures that are capable of generating large amounts of electricity through their nervous system, about 600 volts to be exact. So if a fish bites one of these electric eels, they get a nasty shock and they let go. That's just a coincidence. The electric eel has a lot of neurons in its body, and when those neurons are activated simultaneously, they just happen to generate a lot of electricity. And that electricity is enough to give whatever fish is trying to eat the eel, it gives it a nasty shock and makes it let go. So that's a coincidence. That's not officially the way that neurons communicate. And you already learned that we measure, when we're studying the heart, we measure something called an electrocardiogram. The electrocardiogram works because it is measuring the electricity that's generated by the heart muscles. Again, the electricity is just a coincidence. The heart muscles, the neurons that stimulate the heart muscles, are basically spraying acetylcholine onto the heart muscle, causing it to contract. And the neuron, as it's doing this, generates a little bit of electricity, but that's just a coincidence. Luckily, we can measure that electricity and use it to study the heart. Finally, you probably know, if you've seen advertisements for these machines on television, Dr. Ho's pain therapy system and so on. There are a lot of gadgets that are for sale on the market, which are designed to stimulate your muscles using electricity. So it is true that it is true that neurons generate electricity, but it's a coincidence. It's not the official way that they transmit signals around the body. It's also true that you can make muscles contract with electricity. If you give an electrical shock to a muscle, it will contract. But the reason for that is because the electricity forced a whole bunch of neurons that are in contact with the muscles to fire, to become activated. Okay, so neurons do generate electricity, but it's a coincidence. They officially transmit signals using neurotransmitters, and there's a lot of research going on in the world at the moment about all of these neurotransmitters that the neurons make and what they do and which cells they affect, and what is the effect on the human body of these neurotransmitters and what they do. All right, now it is true that a neuron, when it's in its resting state, is polarized. The word polarized means that positive and negative are both called poles. So if you have a battery, both sides of the battery are called poles, P-O-L-E-S, poles. And one of the poles is called a negative pole, one of them is called a positive pole. So when something is electrically charged like that, so one pole is negative and the other is positive, we say that whatever we're talking about, we say that it's polarized. We say that it's polarized. And the neurons, when they are resting, they are polarized because they're slightly more negative inside than they are outside. So that's referred to as a resting membrane potential. What that means is that the membrane of the neuron is more negative inside than it is outside, therefore the neuron is polarized. It's actually the polarization is on one side of the membrane or the other. So we call that a resting membrane potential. Okay, now if another neuron stimulates that neuron, it may cause that neuron to fire or depolarize. It will cause it to become active. Right? So that's called depolarization when that happens. And when a neuron is stimulated like that, it's referred to as an action potential. An action potential. Right? So neurons generally sit there in a polarized state until they are stimulated by one or more other neurons. Those other neurons stimulate them by spraying neurotransmitters onto them. And if the neuron actually depolarizes, basically what happens is there are channels, membrane channels in the membrane. You heard about that during the second or third lecture of the course. Those channels will open up and let positive ions flow in and negative ions flow out so that it's no longer polarized. It's the same charge inside the cell as it is outside, so the cell is depolarized. Okay. And then I mentioned earlier that a neuron has different parts. It has a body where the nucleus is located. Sticking out from the body are these little tiny short appendages called dendrites. The dendrites are generally there to receive signals from other neurons, and then once the neuron is stimulated and an action potential is reached, it will transmit the signal down this long appendage called an axon, and at the end of the axon, the end of the axon is called a terminal button. It squirts or sprays a little bit of neurotransmitter onto another neuron, which will stimulate it, or it may squirt a little bit of neurotransmitter onto a muscle, causing the muscle to contract, because there are motor neurons whose job it is to communicate with the muscles. All right, so here we have a picture of a neuron. Right, so here's the body. There's the cell body. These short appendages, short things that are sticking out, are called dendrites. Generally, another neuron will stimulate an adjacent cell by spraying some neurotransmitter onto the dendrites or onto the cell body. It doesn't matter, but having the dendrites makes it possible for more neurons to stimulate this particular neuron. So that's part of the idea. And then we have this long appendage called an axon. That appendage could be anywhere from 10 microns in length to 10 millimeters or even 10 centimeters in length. So the axon could be 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times longer than the cell body. And then at the end, we have things called terminal bulbs. And then at the end of the terminal bulb, there's something called a terminal button, which is where the neurotransmitter is sprayed from one neuron to another. These are, by the way, these are what neurons look like on a histology slide. I'm sure you've seen it. So there is the axon, and there are the dendrites. And these other things here are actually nuclei of support cells, which are called glial cells, or glia, G-L-I-A, glia, plural, glial, singular. So neurons are the main important actors in the nervous system, and glial cells are there to support them and carry out various functions that support the activity of neurons. All right, now take a look at this. Here we have one cell up here, which is stimulating another cell down here. And so what happens is that a signal travels down the axon, and at the synapse, some neurotransmitter chemical is sprayed into the synapse by the acting cell onto the passive cell. If that happens enough, if it sprays a lot onto there, or if several neurons are trying to activate this other cell at once, it will depolarize and send its own signal down its own axon to another neuron or to a muscle, for example. Right? So that's how neurons communicate with each other and how they communicate with muscles. Okay, so here's a close-up of again a close-up of the synapse. So in the synapse we have vesicles that are filled with acetylcholine or serotonin, depending on what type of neuron this is, or there are several other types of neurons that produce other neurotransmitters. And so this neuron sprays a little bit, releases a bit of this neural transmitter into the synapse, which then has the effect of stimulating the next cell, and it will then transmit its own signal. Okay, this is what I meant by polarization. If you take a look at one of the dendrites of the cell, or the cell itself, of course it has a membrane, which is a phospholipid bilayer, and that membrane is filled with channels. You don't need to know this for this course, but those channels are referred to as the sodium-potassium pump. And what they do is they pump enough sodium outside of the cell and enough potassium inside of the cell so that the cell is slightly more negative on the inside, which is what this drawing is showing you. These little lines here indicate negative charges, and these little pluses on the outside indicate positive charges. So it turns out that for those of you who know chemistry, you know that potassium ions and sodium ions have a charge of +1. So why would it make any difference if you pump sodium inside and sodium outside and potassium inside? Well, the reason is because what happens is these membrane channels, the sodium-potassium pump, what they do is they send 3 sodiums outside the cell, for 3 sodium ions, 3 sodium cations outside the cell for every 2 potassium cations that they bring into the cell. So eventually every time you move 2 pluses inside, you move 3 pluses outside. Eventually the cell will end up becoming the inside of the cell will be slightly negative relative to the outside of the cell. Put another way, the outside of the cell will be slightly more positive than the inside of the cell because these membrane channels pumped more sodiums outside of the cell than they pumped potassiums inside of the cell. Okay, now if this cell is stimulated to depolarize, these channels will open up and allow sodium to freely go inside the cell and potassium to freely flow outside the cell until both sides of the cell, inside and outside of the cell, are neutral, and that's called depolarization. And then the channels will close and then start to pump the sodium back out and the potassium back in until the cell is polarized again, and that's called a resting membrane potential. Okay, so this graph indicates that inside a cell you have -70 millivolts, Right? That's the resting membrane potential. And if another cell is going to stimulate this cell and cause it to depolarize or to fire, as they say, you have to exceed this threshold. What that means is that, I won't ask you about this on the test, but what it means is that if one neuron stimulates another neuron, that other neuron will let a few ions in and out of its membrane so that the negative charge will be dissipated a little bit. But unless it gets dissipated enough to cross this threshold, the neuron will not depolarize. It will not fire. However, if the cell is stimulated, if a neuron is stimulated by several other neurons at once or stimulated by the same neuron several times in a short period of time, they will actually exceed this threshold and cause the neuron to fire. And that's what this means. When the neuron fires, when it depolarizes, the action is called an action potential. Action potential is a fancy word that simply means the neuron was stimulated and it then transmitted its own signal. Okay, so as I said, neurons are supported by glial cells that do there are a number of different types of glial cells. Some of them are macrophages whose job it is to keep bacteria out of the nervous system. Some of them do other things which we'll discuss shortly. Okay, so now neurves, as I said, are simply bundles of neurons. And then here's an interesting fact that you definitely need to know. The neurons that transmit signals over the longest distances have to be insulated by a lipid called myelin. So typically the neurons with the longest axons are located in the spinal column and in the inner part of the brain that leads into the spinal column, and also in the peripheral nerves. Now, whenever you have myelin is a lipid, and it's a kind of a, lipids are fats basically, and fatty things are kind of a yellowish white. And so neurons that are insulated by myelin have a white appearance, and so we call any large gathering of myelinated neurons, we refer to that as white matter. If the neurons are not insulated with myelin, they have a gray appearance, and we call that gray matter. So that's what we mean by gray matter versus white matter. You might have heard that as an expression. Somebody says, use your gray matter to solve that problem. They mean use the neurons in your head, because the neurons in the brain are not insulated, and so the brain has a kind of a pinkish gray color to it. All right, now by the way, the cells that produce the myelin are another example of glial cells. So myelin is produced by certain types of glial cells. They have various names. Some of them are called oligodendrocytes. Some of them are called Schwann cells, which we'll talk about later. And the central nervous system refers to the neurons in the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system refers to the outer areas of the body. Okay, so now if a neuron has a very long axon and it has to transmit signals over long distances, the axon needs to be insulated with myelin. The myelin is actually produced by other cells that are either called Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes, depending on where you find them. And those cells actually wrap themselves around the axon of that neuron, like the illustration shows here. So these cells, these particular type of glial cells that produce the myelin, they don't produce it and then paste it onto the outside of the axon, for instance. They produce it inside their own body, and then they wrap their own body around the axon in order to insulate it. Okay, and they have a whitish appearance. Okay, so I said that neurons generate electricity. It's just a coincidence. So again, don't think that that neurons transmit signals using electricity. They transmit signals using neurotransmitters, which are chemicals. But for the same reason that electrical wires need to be insulated with rubber in order to prevent the signal from being dissipated over long distances, neurons need to be insulated with myelin. And the myelin is produced by certain types of glial cells. They have different names depending on where you find them in the body. And they provide the same function. They insulate this kind of a wire thing. Okay, here's a close-up of it. So here you have notice that in this case, this is called a Schwann cell that's producing the myelin, and the Schwann cell has literally wrapped itself around the axon of the neuron in order to protect it and in order to make sure the signal doesn't get dissipated. Okay, and then if you put together a whole bunch of neurons with long axons, and then you wrap them up in some connective tissue, you produce something called a nerve. And so there are many nerves that come out of the spinal cord or go back into the spinal cord, and that travel out from the spinal cord to the far reaches of the body, or from the far reaches of the body back to the spinal cord and then back up to the brain again. And as I said before, if you have neurons, here we have a picture of the brain. It's an illustration of the brain. If we do a slice through it, a frontal slice, a frontal plane through the brain, you can see that the neurons that are on the outside of the brain, in this case this is called the cerebral cortex, they have a pinkish gray appearance, and so we call them gray matter. And the neurons that are, these are neurons that are about to send their signals down the spinal column, right? And so they are insulated and they have a whitish appearance, so we call that white matter. So obviously the innermost part of the brain is called white matter. The outside of the brain is called gray matter because of its appearance. The spinal cord is made entirely of white matter. So the spinal cord itself is made entirely of white matter neurons. The neurons that are in the inner core of the brain are also insulated, so they are white matter as well. All right, so we mentioned the fact that sensory neurons bring information from the outside world to the brain. Motor neurons, this is where the brain sends signals down the spinal cord, causing muscles to contract. What they do, in fact, is they spray acetylcholine. They spray acetylcholine onto a muscle, but they don't actually. The gap between the little space between the axon of a neuron and the muscle is not referred to as the synapse. In this case, in the case of a case of a motor neuron, you call the space between the neuron and the muscle, you call it a neuromuscular junction instead of a synapse, but it's basically the same thing. It just refers to the little tiny space between the axon of one neuron and the muscle. Okay, and then because the body is very large and neurons are not that big, they can have very long axons, but they're not that long. Sometimes we can't make it from the brain all the way to the end of your finger using just one neuron. You may have to stretch that distance with 2 or 3 neurons, and so that's very common that you have one neuron that originates in the brain, one neuron that originates in the end of your finger, and in between you have something called an interneuron. And so if that were the case, we had one neuron in the brain, one in your finger, and then one in between, so that it actually takes 3 individual neurons for the signal to get from the end of your finger to the brain. We did that with the help, the middle one is called an interneuron. We did that with the help of an interneuron. Okay, so the sensory neurons see things in the world, smell things, hear things, send the information to the central nervous system. The central nervous system then decides to do something about whatever you're seeing or hearing and tells the muscles to do things using motor neurons. Okay, so to summarize everything we now know about neurons, neurons have a body, they have dendrites, and they have an axon. The axon can be, in some cases, fantastically long. The axons in the spinal, the axons of the neurons that are in the spinal column are very long. The axons that are part of the neurons in the cerebral cortex, the brain surface, are very short because they're just communicating with other neurons that are right next door. Okay, so the signals that are received by neurons are usually received either by squirting the neurotransmitter onto the body of the adjacent cell or onto one of the dendrites. Either one will do. And then, so we spray neurotransmitters. I gave you 2 examples, acetylcholine and serotonin. Acetylcholine is used both in the brain and with motor neurons in the muscles. Serotonin is mostly used just in the brain. So the main neurotransmitter that is used by motor neurons is acetylcholine, but we also use acetylcholine in the brain for thinking. Okay, so when neurons have not been stimulated, they sit there in a polarized state, a resting state called a resting membrane potential. If they're stimulated by another neuron, they may depolarize, they may fire, that's called an action potential. Neurons that have very long axons are insulated with myelin, and we call that white matter. And a nerve is simply a bundle of neurons that's put together with a blood vessel or two and some connective tissue on the outside. And it's sort of like a transatlantic or a trans-Pacific cable, telephone cable. So now let's move on from what neurons look like to what the nervous system itself looks like. And we'll start with the brain and the spinal column. All right, now to begin with, the brain is surrounded by the skull, as you know, and then between the skull and the brain, we have three layers of membranes that are collectively referred to as the meninges. The meninges. Right. Now, here's an interesting thing for you. What is meningitis? You might have heard that term. I mentioned earlier in the course that inflammation is when a body part becomes inflamed. It hurts, it swells up, and it turns red, usually as a result of some kind of an infection, but it could also be due to some kind of trauma or an impact. If you get hit on a part of your body, it will swell up and turn red usually. That's, again, an example of inflammation. So you can have inflammation that's caused by infection or inflammation that's caused by a mechanical insult, as it's called, a mechanical stress. Okay, so when you want to indicate that a certain part of the body is inflamed, you take the name of that body part and you add itis, I-T-I-S, to the end of it. So the meninges are the membranes that surround the brain. If they become inflamed, you call it meningitis. If the appendix becomes inflamed, you call it an appendicitis or appendicitis. If the liver becomes inflamed, you call that hepatitis, because the liver, you could call it liveritis, but they've decided that the better term is hepatitis, because hepatocytes are the cells that form the liver. So hepatitis is an inflamed liver. Appendicitis is an inflamed appendix, and then meningitis is an inflamed membranes around the brain. These membranes are part of the blood-brain barrier, by the way. So there are three membranes going from the outside layer to the inside layer. They are called the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Right? So we have the meninges from the outside in. We have dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. The dura mater is directly underneath the skull. Okay, now if you look at the brain itself, it's actually divided in half into two separate lobes called hemispheres. Just like the Earth, we call it the north and the south, northern and the southern hemisphere. So you have two hemispheres that are dividing the brain in half, and they're connected by a bundle of white matter neurons that are called the corpus callosum. So there's a very large structure that's connecting the two hemispheres of the brain called the corpus callosum. You should be aware of that word and what it is. And the two halves of the brain control the two sides of the body, but on opposite sides, which is what we call contralateral control of the body. Contralateral control means that the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body and vice versa. Okay, so remember what contralateral control of the body is. Okay, now the very outer surface of the brain that contains all of those gray matter neurons that I told you about earlier is referred to as the cerebral cortex. And this part of the body, we believe, this part of the brain is responsible for thinking, speaking, body control, interpretation of senses from the world. Everything, all of that stuff happens there. We believe that, the human consciousness rests there. So that's the person, essentially. That's your personality, is where that's where it is located, in the cerebral cortex. Many of us, including me, think that there's more to, more to your spirit than just that. But some people believe that's all there is to it. I'm not one of those people. Okay, so so all of this the highest levels of thought occur in the human cerebral cortex. And remember, when we talked about the kidneys, for instance, whenever you have the outer surface of an organ, you call it the cortex. And what do you call the inner surface of an organ? You call it the medulla. Okay, so cortex versus medulla. The cerebral cortex is the outer surface of the brain, which is composed entirely of gray matter neurons. Billions and billions of them with very short axons. They're simply talking to each other. They're not sending signals out to the body. They're talking to each other and making decisions and so on. All right, now if you look at the posterior side of the brain, on the inferior surface, there's a little bulgy part about the size of an apple, a small apple, which is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is made of nerves, neurons that help us to coordinate fine motor movements. The word motor simply means movement, movement using muscles. So if you reach out and you grab your pencil, you were able to judge the distance from your hand to the pencil fairly accurately, otherwise you wouldn't have been able to grab it. And the muscles were stimulated just enough to move your hand just the right distance to grab the pencil. That was all a function of the the cerebellum. And if you didn't have a cerebellum, people who have damage to their cerebellum have difficulty with that kind of movement. Okay, so the cerebellum is involved in adjusting and coordinating fine body movements. Okay, then if you look inside the brain, sort of like in the medulla of the brain, right, there is a collection of structures that we call the diencephalon. The diencephalon consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and two things that are not actually part of the brain, the pituitary gland and the pineal gland. You might remember what those are from the endocrine system, right? So for whatever reason, people who study the brain group those things together and call them the diencephalon. So you should know that word as well. And then if you go even deeper into the center of the cerebral cortex, like deeper into the medulla of the brain, you find two structures, the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are collectively referred to as the limbic system. The limbic system is responsible for consolidating and retrieving memories. So when you're trying to memorize this lecture, you're doing it with the help of the hippocampus. The amygdala is responsible for sort of very primitive emotions like anger and rage and things like that. So obviously those two functions are not related, but they are located in the same space, and so the same place. And so the place that they're located, the amygdala and the hippocampus, are collectively called the limbic system. And then at the very bottom, sort of on the lower part of the brain, we have something called the brain stem. The brain stem is responsible for very primitive body functions such as controlling the heart rate and controlling the breathing rate. You learned about how the depth of breath is controlled by a structure called the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is located in the brainstem. So that's one example of a structure in the brainstem. And controlling the depth of breathing and controlling the heart rate are two of the kind of things that the brainstem does. All right, here we have a picture of the meninges. So up here we have the skull. So we have a frontal section of through the skull here. This down here is the brain gray matter. This is the brain white matter. This is the space between the two hemispheres of the brain. So we have two hemispheres of the brain. And then the three meninges, we have the dura mater on the top, the outermost layer, the arachnoid mater in the middle. Arachnoid refers to spiders, and this layer of tissue kind of looks like a bunch of spider webs, which is where it gets its name, the arachnoid mater. And then the pia mater on the very inside. The pia mater is responsible for kind of sucking the oxygen out of the blood and putting it into the pia mater produces the cerebrospinal fluid by extracting things from the blood. All right, now dura mater, because the dura mater is the outermost membrane, the area directly below the dura mater is referred to as subdural. Sub, S-U-B, as in submarine, subdural. Sub means underneath. The subdural area is any area just under the dura mater. Okay, now, If you have an injury to any of the blood vessels inside the brain, it is sometimes called a subdural hematoma. Whenever you have blood, like a bruise is technically called a hematoma. The word hematoma technically means anywhere that you have a blood vessel burst or break inside the body, and you end up getting this kind of a bag of blood, filling up a bag of blood. Right now, a subdural hematoma is where you have a blood vessel burst underneath the dura mater, and the blood starts flooding into the skull where it can't get out. You know, if you bleed, the blood goes out of the body, that's fine. I mean, that's bad, but you can deal with it. But the problem with bleeding in the brain is that the brain neurons do not like to be compressed. They do not like to be compressed. And if you compress or pinch neurons, you either get pain or eventually they'll die. Right? So if you compress neurons for a long enough period of time, they'll die. And that's what happens if you have a subdural hematoma. Subdural hematoma is where you have bleeding in the brain. The inflow of blood to the brain builds up the pressure because there's nowhere for the blood to go. This puts pressure on the brain, which will eventually kill you. And so that's called, when that happens, that's called, when you have a burst like this, it's called a subdural hematoma. If you're diagnosed to have a subdural hematoma, it's critical that you get the blood out of the skull as fast as possible before it basically crushes the brain and kills you. So emergency medical technicians will take a really drastic measure, and they'll take a power drill and they'll drill a hole in your skull to let the blood out. Obviously, putting a drill through your skull is a very dangerous thing to do, but it's been deemed to be less dangerous than allowing the blood to stay in there and crush your brain. So that's the emergency measure that people use to cure a subdural hematoma. They drill a hole in your head with a power drill and let the blood out, and then they worry about infection and infection and sealing up the blood vessel later. Okay, now the reason I put this picture here is some of you might, I'm just going to make this lecture a little bit more relatable. I'm going to include some famous people that you may or may not know and talk about their experiences with some of the neurological pathologies that we're going to talk about. So you may recognize that this guy is an actor named Liam Neeson, and sadly his wife Natasha died of a subdural hematoma when they were skiing in Canada a few years ago. She fell and hit her head on a rock or something like that, and she got a subdural hematoma. One of the characteristics of a subdural hematoma is that you start initially you bang your head and you initially feel disoriented, and then you may go through a period where you feel fine. As the blood is starting to flow into the brain, you don't feel any effects, but as the pressure starts to build up, then suddenly you feel ill again. So that's what happened to this poor woman. She banged her head while she was skiing. They called for an ambulance that came from Montreal. It took 20 minutes for the ambulance to get there. By the time the ambulance got there, she said, I feel fine now, you can go. And they left. They never should have left. I think you can probably blame her death on the ambulance crew, because they never should. If you have a bang, if you have a blow to the head and you were initially disoriented, you definitely need to go and have a look at it, because you might have a subdural hematoma, which takes a few minutes to manifest itself. And so what happened was they sent the ambulance away because she was feeling fine, and then she suddenly started to convulse, and the ambulance, it's a long trip from Montreal to the ski resort, so in the time that it took the ambulance to come back, she was dead. And so that was a tragedy. So next time you see Liam Neeson, the actor, you can remember that this is how he lost his wife to a subdural hematoma. It's quite a tragic event. If you're a celebrity, you're still not immune from tragedies in your life. So that's what happened here. All right, so let's take a look at the two halves of the brain. This is a posterior view of the brain on the left, meaning that we're looking at it from the back. You can see the cerebellum kind of underneath the posterior to and inferior to the cerebral cortex. The brain is divided into two halves called hemispheres. So we have a left and a right hemisphere. The two halves are connected by a bundle of white matter neurons called the corpus callosum. You do need to know that word. And we have contralateral control over the body, where the left side of the body controls the right side, or the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and vice versa. Okay, this is looking, here's an anterior view of the brain on the right, and on the left we have a lateral view of the brain. This is showing you sort of where the corpus callosum is located in between the two hemispheres. Some of you that have studied psychology, or that are studying psychology, have heard of the left brain, right brain theory of psychology. The idea that the theory that the left side of the brain does slightly different things than the right side of the brain. You might be interested to know that that theory was developed as a result of studying patients who had their corpus callosum cut. The corpus callosum allows the left and right hemispheres to talk to each other continuously and instantaneously. If you cut it, there are people who had brain tumors or people who suffered from epilepsy where they had no choice. The surgeon's only choice to cure them was to cut the corpus callosum. And then they took those people and asked them to volunteer to do psychological studies, and many of them did. And that's how we kind of learned that if the two hemispheres of the brain are not allowed to communicate with each other, they do sort of kind of act a little bit differently when they're not talking to each other. So the left brain, right brain theory that you hear about in your psychology class was originally developed by studying patients who had their corpus callosum cut. Now, when I was a student, I was your age, I had there was a very prestigious neuroanatomy professor at Simon Fraser University named Hal Weinberg. He was one of Canada's famous neurologists, and he used to throw ice water on that theory by saying that, if you wanted to learn how a man walks, you could cut off his right leg and then say walk, and he'd hop around on his left leg. And if you cut off his left leg, he'd probably crawl. But does that, when you destroy things, does that tell you anything about how the system works when it's intact? And so his idea was maybe, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. You have to treat it with a little bit of skepticism. So just remember that the left brain, right brain theory in your psychology class was originally based on patients that had their corpus callosum cut. All right, so let's take another look at the lateral view of the brain and see that each of the two hemispheres is divided up into 4 different lobes. What's classified as the frontal lobe, right? The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Right, so we have 2 hemispheres. Each of the hemispheres is individually divided into 4 lobes. There's the little cerebellum on the bottom, sort of on the posterior inferior side of the brain. All right, now what about the cerebral cortex? Notice that it's all folded like this. By the way, every time that you have a bump, right, one of these, if you look at these individual folds, a bump is called a gyrus, and the little dent, the opposite of the bump, is called a sulcus, right? So if you look at every one of these folds, every fold consists of a gyrus and a sulcus. And the more folds you have, it's interesting that the human brain is highly folded. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. The idea is, our theory is, as biologists, that if thinking and reasoning and all of this other stuff, all of these higher thought processes that humans have, is a function of the cerebral cortex, the more cerebral cortex you have, the smarter you'll be. Isn't that true? Probably. Right? So the more cerebral cortex you have, the smarter you'll be. So take a look at this. This is the human brain. Right? This is a monkey brain, and this is a mouse brain. So notice that the 3 different brains, I mean, I think everyone would agree that a human is smarter than a monkey, and a monkey is smarter than a mouse, and a human is much smarter than a mouse. But notice that the brains are not just different sizes, but they also have different degrees of folding. So notice that the mouse brain is not only small, but it is also not really folded at all. And so the theory is that if thinking is a function of the cerebral cortex, the more cerebral cortex you have, how are you going to fit a large amount of cerebral cortex into a small space like the skull? The only way you can do that is by folding it. right? So you crumple it up and you fold it, you fold it, fold it, fold it. Folding it is a way of fitting a large surface area into a small space. So the theory is the evolutionary biologists and regular biologists believe that humans evolved to have a much larger cerebral cortex, but without evolving a larger skull. Right, so the size of the skull was also limited by the size of the birth canal, right? So that we talked about earlier during the reproductive system that 14% of women have to have an episiotomy. The vagina has to be cut in order to let the baby's head out, because the human head is so big now that it barely fits out of the vagina. It has trouble getting out of the vagina during birth, right? So this evolution is not a systematic thing. It's kind of haphazard. So we should have a bigger head. If you're going to have if you want to have more cerebral cortex, you need to have a bigger head. If you can't have a bigger head, then you fold it. That's the best you can do. And maybe you have a little bit of a bigger head, but then you should also evolve a larger vagina to make it easier for this larger head to get out. But these things are obviously occurring haphazardly, not systematically. So that's just the way it was. But so humans have a very highly folded cerebral cortex, and we believe that that's one of the reasons why they are smarter than other animals that not only have a smaller brain but which have less folding. For instance, a whale has a brain that's bigger than a human's, but a human is probably smarter than a whale. And if you look at a whale brain, you'll see that it's not folded as much as the human brain. It's bigger, but it's not folded as much. And so if you pulled all of the cerebral cortex out, you'd see that it's bigger in a human than it is in a whale. All right, now given what I just said, how can you explain this? Right, so there on the left we have a human brain, and on the right we have a dolphin brain, which is at least as folded as the human brain. And notice that these are both posterior views, so notice that the dolphins have a much bigger cerebellum. So dolphins are capable of having an incredible amount of coordination, but more interestingly, they have a very folded cerebral cortex. So how does this happen exactly? Does that mean dolphins are as smart as humans? I don't know. But dolphins do have a language that they use to communicate with each other that we're just starting to understand. And we also have the belief that most of the human brain, the cerebral cortex, is not taken up by reason. It's taken up by, most of the brain is dedicated to understanding relationships between individuals in your society, right? So let me ask you, which is easier? Is it easier to do math problems, or is it easier to gossip about your friends with your other friends, right? I find it, I'm a typical human. I find it much easier to remember gossip than to remember mathematics and to do problems. So why is the human brain so big and the dolphin brain is so big? The human and the dolphin are not using their brains to do math problems. They're using their brains to understand relationships between individuals in their society. And humans and dolphins do that equally well. They both do that quite well. Okay, so that was a little bit of a digression. But the human cerebral cortex is highly folded, and we will talk about the different functions of the different lobes that constitute each of the two hemispheres. All right, let's talk about the functions of the four the functions of the four lobes, each of which is present on each of the two hemispheres. All right, so the frontal lobe that I showed you is believed to be responsible for what are called executive functions. Executive functions mean concentration, self-control, thinking hard about things like that. It may interest you to know that a lot of the violent criminals that are locked up in jail for violent acts have a higher than expected percentage of them have damage to the frontal lobes of their brain, usually developmental problems, but as opposed to brain damage from a blow or something like that. But one of the executive functions is self-control, meaning that if somebody insults you, you may want to punch them in the face, but you don't do that because you have control over your actions. Somebody who has a weak or a dysfunctional frontal lobe may not be able to restrain themselves from violently losing their temper. So there's a lot that we don't know about that, but a lot of the things, the self-control, the self-discipline, concentrating on things, all of that is a function, we believe, of the frontal lobe. Now, we believe that partly because we observe what happens if you have damage to the frontal lobe. Okay, and now on the left side of the brain, the left frontal lobe specifically, we have a very important area that's referred to as Broca's area. Broca's area is needed for speech. Right, so Broca's area is needed for speech. So typically, if you have an adult who has damage to the left frontal lobe and Broca's area is damaged, they lose the ability to speak, temporarily at least. Now, sometimes you can gain that ability to speak back because the brain exhibits something called neuroplasticity. Plasticity comes from the word plastic. The word plastic means that something can be molded. If something is plastic, it means that it has the ability to change its shape or to fit into another type of a shape, whatever shape you choose. So plasticity means that you can change it. It's amiable to change. Right, so neuroplasticity means that if you damage one part of the brain, in many cases, another part of the brain can learn how to do what the damaged part used to be doing. So it is true that sometimes people have a stroke or some other kind of damage. They have an ischemic stroke or a hemorrhagic stroke that damages Broca's area, and they lose the ability to speak for a while, but eventually after a while they can learn to speak again. And if we go and look at the brain, we'll find that now the right frontal lobe has developed a Broca's area so they can learn to speak, so they can speak. All right, so Broca's area, which is critical for speech, is in the left frontal lobe. The occipital lobe is located on the back of the brain, on the posterior side of the brain. It's responsible for interpreting visual information. So if you have a damaged occipital lobe, you could be blind even though your eyes are perfectly fine. So there's no damage to your eyes, but if you damage the occipital lobe, that could blind you. The temporal lobe is located behind the temples of the head, and it is responsible for hearing, auditory information. And the parietal lobe its function is hard to understand, but it kind of integrates all of the sensory information from these other lobes. Okay, so the kind of allows you to put together the visual and the auditory, the hearing information and the sensory information. Okay, but the most obvious functions are for the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. All right, so here's a drawing of a skull, a diagram of the brain rather. So here we have the frontal lobe, right, including Broca's area right there, right? And then if you look at the very frontal part of the frontal lobe, you call that the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision making and planning and other executive functions. Okay, so over here we have the parietal lobe. Over here we have the occipital lobe, which is responsible for interpreting visual information. Over here we have the temporal lobe, which is responsible for hearing auditory information, known as the auditory cortex. Right? And over here there's another area that I didn't mention before, but it's related to Broca's area. It's called Wernicke's area. So Broca's area is responsible when you're forming words. You need Broca's area if you're trying to form words. If you're trying to understand the words that somebody else is speaking, Wernicke's area is important. So if you had somebody who was damaged in Broca's area, their brain is damaged in Broca's area, they would not be able to speak, but they could understand when somebody speaks to them. On the other hand, if you have somebody who has a damaged Wernicke's area, they would be able to speak, but they couldn't understand other people speaking to them. Okay, and then down here we have the cerebellum. This thing way down here in the bottom is the brainstem. All right, now this is something that's interesting. This figure is something called a PET scan, a positron emission tomography scan. I don't expect you to remember that name, but it's a type of an analysis that you can do to the brain. The positron emission tomography. Basically, what this does is it's a computerized picture that you put somebody into a tube that is an NMR tube, a nuclear magnetic resonance tube. And you measure how much glucose and how much oxygen is being used by the different parts of the brain. And so the colors, the darker colors mean that part of the brain is not being used very much. The brighter colors mean that that part of the brain is being used a lot. So here they've overlaid a picture of the brain, and they do various things to volunteer patients. Patients volunteer to participate in these studies. And so this tells you which parts of the brain are working the hardest when you're doing each of these things. So when you're hearing words, it's Wernicke's area that's working the hardest. When you're seeing words, it's the occipital cortex that's working hardest. When you're speaking words, it's Broca's area. Also, this I'll get to this later, but this is the motor cortex, this other part that's being used. That when you're speaking, the motor cortex controls all. It's the somatic system's control over all the different parts of the body. So naturally, when you're speaking, you're using some of the muscles to speak, and so that's why that area is showing up as well as Broca's area. And when you're trying to think of the word to use, it's Broca's area that's working. Right. So this. We didn't invent positron emission tomography until the 80s, until the early 1980s or the late 1970s. But we knew that these areas of the brain did these things much sooner than that, because we used to do things called ablation studies, and also, we would observe, scientists would observe what losses of function you had when you had accidental damage to different parts of the brain. So whenever somebody had by accident a brain tumor that caused them to lose a piece of their brain or something like that, they would, the scientists would ask them if they were willing to participate in studies to see what exactly are the effects of losing that piece of your brain. And so this is how we kind of got the idea that all of these brain parts did all of these different things. All right, now I want to draw your attention to these two gyruses here. So remember a dent, if you have a fold, the bump of the fold is called a gyrus, the dent of the fold is called a sulcus. This very large sulcus that runs sort of halfway down the brain and separates the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe is called the central sulcus. And then we have a gyrus that comes before it and a gyrus that comes after it. The gyrus that is anterior to the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus. The gyrus that's posterior to the central sulcus is called the postcentral gyrus, but they also have the names motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. Right now, the motor cortex controls the skeletal muscles. This is the somatic nervous system's control over the muscles. So when we are moving different parts of our body, we're doing it from here. Right? We are doing it from the motor cortex. On the other hand, when we feel sensations, the sensation of touch on our skin, somebody's touching the back of your hand or something's brushing against your leg, you're feeling it from here. This is where the sensory information from the skin arrives. The somatosensory cortex gives you the sense of touch. All right, now I want to show you an interesting diagram that shows we have physically mapped the locations of all of the sensations and all of the motor functions of the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. All right, so as I said, the central groove in the brain is called the central sulcus, and a bump is called a gyrus. Right, so the precentral gyrus is also known as the motor cortex, which is responsible for voluntary movements throughout the body. And the postcentral gyrus, which is also known as the somatosensory cortex, is responsible for sensations on the skin. Now, something that's part of the peripheral nervous system, not the central nervous system, but something that's part of the peripheral nervous system, is that your skin is divided up into bands in the body called dermatones. And so when you feel sensations on your skin, those sensations are divided up into bands that run across your body, kind of like the tires on the Michelin Tire Man advertisement. And those nerves that are underneath those layers of skin, those bands of skin, they enter the spine through a particular vertebra. And those dermatones, each dermatome is named after the particular vertebra that the nerves go into before they start heading upwards towards the brain. So those are called dermatones. Okay. And then finally, how did we learn all of this stuff? How did we learn which parts of the brain are responsible for moving which parts of the body, and which parts of the brain are responsible for the different sensations and whatnot? Before positron emission tomography, before we invented PET scanning, we used to do that using a technique called interoperative brain mapping. So interoperative brain mapping means that when you do brain surgery on somebody, let's say some poor unfortunate person has a tumor, the neurosurgeon, a neurosurgeon is somebody who operates on the brain, the neurosurgeon goes in there and they cut out the tumor, but they will ask the patient, hey, when I'm in there cutting out the tumor, do you mind if I poke around a little bit and you tell me what you're feeling when I poke different parts of your brain with a little electrode? And many people were nice enough to volunteer and say yes. Now, what you may or may not know is that the brain itself cannot feel pain. So what they do is when they do brain surgery on you, you're usually awake. Which is not a very nice thought, but many people are usually awake during brain surgery. So what they don't knock you out, they don't put you to sleep. What they do is they give you a general anesthetic so that you don't feel it when they cut the skin of your head. The skin on top of your head is called the scalp. So they give you a local anesthetic like a dentist does so that you don't feel it when they cut your scalp. But then you're awake, and so they drill a hole in your skull, or sometimes they cut the top of the skull off completely, and then they poke around in your brain, and they will often ask you to give them feedback, and you know that's different. People have different reactions to that. I would think that it's more traumatic for some people than others. Many people are fine, whatever, and some people think, oh, that's a terrible thing to do to me during brain surgery, but that's what they do. So interoperative brain mapping is one of the ways people volunteered while they were having brain surgery. They volunteered to have the surgeon go in there and poke around and tell them what they were feeling when they were poking around. And so for probably 60, 70 years, we learned about the different parts of the brain and what they did by interoperative brain mapping. All right, so let's see what we found out through interoperative brain mapping. All right, so the motor cortex is on the left, the somatosensory cortex is on the right, and we found that these parts of the cerebral cortex in the motor cortex are responsible for moving the toes. These parts are responsible for moving the knees, the muscles and the legs and so on. And so this diagram shows you how much of the precentral gyrus, how much of the motor cortex is dedicated to controlling each of these parts of the body. Notice that there's not very much brain, not very many neurons have been committed or used to control the toes. And that's probably why we don't have very much control over our toes. Right? A lot of the brain has been dedicated to controlling the hand, and a lot of it has been dedicated to controlling the face. Right. Now if you go over here to the somatosensory cortex, you'll see that not very much of the brain is dedicated to feeling things on your foot. And that's why if you're like me, if you have an itch on the sole of your foot and you have trouble finding where to scratch it, because first of all the skin on the sole of your foot is very thick, so it's hard to scratch anyway. But even it's hard to figure out where the itch is coming from so that you can scratch it and relieve it. And the reason for that is because you don't have very good resolution. Resolution means the amount of detail that you can see. Right? So you don't have very good resolution for touch sensations on the bottom of your foot because very little of the brain is dedicated to interpreting the sensations there. Okay, but you have a lot of resolution about your hand, for instance, right? So your hand, if you close your eyes and somebody touches the back of your hand or the front of your hand, you can tell exactly where your hand is being touched, which you probably couldn't do with the bottom of your foot. And the same would be true for your face and so on. Right? So this is an interesting diagram that just shows how much of your brain is dedicated to controlling or to interpreting senses from these different parts of your body. All right, you might ask, why is so much of the brain dedicated to controlling the face? What's the advantage of that? Well, uh, I don't know if it was designed this way. I mean, there's a debate going on about whether the human body was designed or whether it simply evolved. And I don't have the ultimate answer. I mean, I'm a biologist and I believe in the theory of evolution. As I said before, some people say that some people claim that believing in evolution means you can't believe in God, but that's actually not true. You can believe in the spiritual world as well as evolution, and many people do, including me. But nevertheless, we have evolved to have a lot of control over our face. And if you look at humans, but if you also look at monkeys, primates like chimpanzees, bonobos, and monkeys, you'll notice that they make a lot of different facial expressions, and they use them for nonverbal communications. So you look at this bonobo, and you can tell that it's kind of puzzled by something, and that's a nonverbal communication. It's kind of mixture of bemusement and frustration. It's puzzled by something, and that's a very complicated, that's a very nuanced emotion, isn't it? But we can read it because we have a lot of control over our face. We use our face to convey emotions. And so we use our face for communications, for nonverbal communications. And you can tell when you're talking to somebody, you can tell more about the conversation when you can see their face than when you can't. And it's because of things like that. So I can't say that the brain was designed to give us a lot of control over our face so that we could do nonverbal communication, but I would say that we use our face for to do a lot of nonverbal communication because we have so much control over it. The fact that we have so much control over our face is determined by how much of the brain is devoted to controlling the face, and how much of the brain is devoted to controlling the face is just a coincidence. It's a simple coincidence. Furthermore, the hand. What about the hand? Well, because we have so much control over our hands, most of the machines that we've designed to use are meant to be controlled by hand. And again, we use our hands to control things because we have a lot of control over our hands. We have a lot of fine motor control over our hands, which other animals don't. There are probably other animals. If other animals were as intelligent as humans, they would build machines that were controlled by different parts of their body, no doubt, because other animals have different control over other parts of their body. Like an octopus has more control over its arms than we do, so an octopus would probably build machines where every tentacle can operate a different button or something like that. Humans just happen to have a lot of control over their hands because a lot of the brain is dedicated to controlling the hands, and therefore we use our hands to do a lot of things, right? So just bear in mind, a lot of our brain is devoted to controlling our hands, and that's why we have so much dexterity in our hands. We have so much control over our hands, and a lot of our brain is dedicated to controlling our face, which is why we use our face to do a lot of nonverbal communication. All right, now the somatosensory cortex, we're feeling different sensations on our skin, and these are the dermatones I was talking about. The human body is divided into a bunch of bands, a bunch of horizontal bands. And if you look closely at this diagram, you notice that each of these bands up here are numbered C2, C4, C5, C6. The C stands for the cervical vertebrae. So there are seven cervical vertebrae in your neck. There are 10 cervical vertebrae. There are 10 vertebrae in your thorax that are numbered T1 through T12. There's 7 vertebrae in your neck that are cervical vertebrae that are numbered C1 through C7. There are 12 vertebrae in your thorax that are numbered T1 through T12, and then there are 5 lumbar vertebrae that are numbered L1 through L5. And what this diagram means is that these bands of flesh, these bands of skin on your body, the sensory nerves that are located just inside or underneath that skin, those sensory nerves go into the spinal cord where indicated. So if you touch yourself on the shoulder, the signal is sent to the somatosensory cortex that's responsible for the shoulder, And the nerve goes into the spinal cord and up to the brain through cervical vertebra number 5. If you can see this well, you'll notice that the index finger is listed as C7. That means if you touch something with your index finger, the signal will go up your arm and into the spinal cord through cervical vertebra 7, and eventually end up in your brain right there in the somatosensory cortex. Right, so that's what dermatones are. Dermatones are nerves inside the skin that are responsible for sensations of touch, pain, pressure, and so on. And those nerves that are located in that part of the body all enter the spinal cord through a certain vertebrae, as indicated by this diagram. And these bands of skin that are serviced by these neurons are referred to as dermatones. Okay, so here we have the, looks like it's coming out of thoracic vertebra number 5 or something like that. So that would be T5, right? Something like that. And as I said, this is kind of unpleasant to think about, but a lot of all of this stuff that we know about the brain was discovered before we invented PET scanning, positron emission tomography. It was done through simple interoperative brain mapping. So here you see a man who's having his brain operated on, and the surgeon is up there poking around. The surgeon has taken the top of his skull off, and he's in there poking around with a probe, and the man is saying, "Oh, so the surgeon touches you in a part of your brain and says, 'What do you feel?' And the man says, 'It feels like you're touching my index finger.' And they poke another part of the brain. He says, 'It feels like you're touching me on the thumb.' And so all of this was done through interoperative brain mapping. The man looks like he's under a bit of stress, and I can't say I blame him at all. I think this would be a very weird situation to be in. I've never been in that situation, thank goodness. But we have to be very grateful to the people who volunteered for these kinds of studies. All right, now let's look at the other parts of the brain. So we've discussed the cortex, the cerebral cortex, and the lobes that the cerebral cortex are divided into. Now let's look at the diencephalon. The diencephalon includes the hypothalamus, and which the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. Right? So the four parts of the brain that are classified as the diencephalon include the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland. But remember that only 2 of the 4 parts of the diencephalon, namely the thalamus and the hypothalamus, these 2 things here are officially neural tissue. Those are made of neurons. The pituitary gland and the pineal gland are not made of neurons, and they are officially they are also classified as being part of the endocrine system. Right? So I could ask you a question on a test. I could say, of the 4 parts what are the 4 parts that make up the diencephalon? And of those 4 parts, which 2 are officially made of neurons rather than part of the endocrine system? Or which 2 of the 4 parts of the diencephalon are classified as also being members of the endocrine system? Right, so that's the diencephalon. So here we are. Notice that the pink coloration here indicates the diencephalon. Right, so we have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, which hypo means underneath, right? And then below the hypothalamus we have the pituitary gland, and then farther back we have the pineal gland back here. Right, so those 4 things are the diencephalon. All right, let's move on to the limbic system. The limbic system is even further inside the brain, sort of in the medulla of the brain. And we have it consists of 2 parts. One part is called the amygdala, which is responsible for a very primitive, savage kind of anger and aggression. And the hippocampus is a totally different function. It's involved in memory consolidation and memory retrieval. That means when you're trying to memorize something, your hippocampus is at work. When you're trying to remember something for a test, your hippocampus is trying to bring it back. Consolidation means memorizing. Retrieval means trying to bring it back, bring the memory back. Okay, now if you have damage to the hippocampus, you will, we're not exactly sure what type of damage causes which type of injury, but if you have a damaged hippocampus, it can lead to amnesia. I'm sure that you know that amnesia means loss of memory. But there are two different types of amnesia. One is called retrograde amnesia and one is called anterograde amnesia, and you need to know the difference. Retrograde amnesia means you can't remember anything that happened in the past, but you can make new memories, right? So if you were injured, if your hippocampus was injured on December 21st, you can't remember anything from December 20th or before, but you can make new memories starting on December 22nd. Right? So you will not remember who your childhood friends are, but you can be introduced to them, and you can memorize their name, and they can tell you that they were friends with you in the first grade or something like that. That's retrograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia means antero means forward. So anterograde amnesia means that you can remember everything from the past, but you can't make new memories, right? So this is a particularly bad type of memory damage because you have to be introduced to the people in your life every day. Every day you can't remember who these people are, right? So you can remember your best friend in the first grade, but you can't remember the nurse that you were introduced to yesterday and the day before, right? So that you have to be reintroduced and explain. Everybody that comes into your life has to explain who they are every day, basically. So retrograde amnesia versus anterograde amnesia, good questions for exams. All right, so just showing you where things are. So the limbic system is located down here. Right, so here we have the amygdala, aggression, and here we have the hippocampus, responsible for consolidating or retrieving memories. All right, the brainstem is the lowest part. Basically, the brainstem is the top of the spinal cord, just above the top of the spinal cord, and it's responsible for rudimentary functions. Rudimentary means basic functions like heart rate and breathing. And we learned about the medulla oblongata in the section in the lecture on the respiratory system. Remember that the medulla oblongata is cueing. It's judging how deeply you should be breathing based on the pH of your blood. So if the pH of your blood is too low, the medulla oblongata assumes that you need to take deeper breaths, and so that's the principle behind a medical device called a rebreather, and also a fancy term for a fancy rebreather. Simple version of a rebreather is just getting somebody to breathe into a paper bag who's hyperventilating. So here we have it. Here's the two parts to the brainstem: the pons, which we're not going to worry about for this course, and the medulla. So the medulla oblongata is where responsible for depth of breathing. All right, now I said that we talked about the nervous system is divided into two parts depending on whether it's the central or the peripheral nervous system. It's also divided into two parts depending on whether we have voluntary functions, voluntary control over the movements or not. So that would be called the somatic nervous system versus the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, the word autonomic sounds like the word automatic. So the autonomic nervous system are various movements of the body, stimulation of muscles, stimulation of organs without us having any control over it. It happens automatically. Somatic means we have control over it. So when you're moving the fingers in your hands, that's an example of the somatic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system may occupy the same place in the body. Right? So it's just that some of the neurons in the nerves are responsible for autonomic functions and some are responsible for somatic functions. But we classify them according to two theoretical divisions: somatic and autonomic. Furthermore, the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. Okay, so as I said, the somatic nervous system means collectively refers to all of the nerves and the parts of the brain and the nerves that allow us to voluntarily move parts of the body, volition. The autonomic nervous system collectively refers to all of the nerves and all of the parts of the brain and all of the organs that are moved without our volition, without us voluntarily doing it. It just happens automatically. Now, if you take the autonomic nervous system and you divide it into, basically it can further be divided in two based on function. And the two divisions are the sympathetic division. Sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is a bunch of reactions in your body that prepare your body to either fight or to run away. This is the so-called fight or flight reflex, which some of you might have heard about in your psychology class. And the parasympathetic division is responsible for rest and digest, meaning it's a bunch of reactions that prepares your body to relax and to regenerate and to digest food and probably to sleep as well. Okay, so sympathetic, somatic versus autonomic is fairly easy to understand, but let's see if we can understand the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic division. Okay. You tell me if this cat is aroused or relaxed. Like, is it about to pounce on a mouse? Or is it purring and it's about to go to sleep, or is it about to jump on a mouse and eat it? Okay, maybe you can't guess. How about this one? Okay, do you notice a very obvious difference between these two cats? And that is the eyes, right? The pupils in this cat are dilated. Dilation means they open up. The pupils are constricted in this one. So the cat, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system has been activated in the cat on the right. The cat on the left, it's the parasympathetic division that's active. Okay, so that there are a number of other reactions that are not as visible, not as obvious as the dilation of the pupils, but there are a lot of other functions. There are a lot of other bodily functions that are going on with the left-hand cat versus the right-hand cat, and those are examples of the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Here's a diagram showing the different functions. It would be in your advantage to memorize some of these. So let's look at the sympathetic division first. And as it turns out, all of the nerves that control the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system travel down the spine and exit through the spinal vertebrae. Right, so you don't need to memorize that, but it's interesting to know that the nerves that control sympathetic division reactions are coming out of the spine, versus the nerves that control the parasympathetic division of the nervous system are coming out of the skull and the sacrum. So these body controls these two body functions are being controlled by different sets of neurons that go in and out of the brain at different locations. Okay, so I will not ask you about that. That's not really an important point. But let's look at some of the things that are an example of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So dilation of the pupils, you know. Other things that prepare your body to fight or flight, I mean, what is the purpose of dilating the pupils? It lets in more light, doesn't it? So you can see more of what's going on. So if something is happening in a slightly darkened place, your pupils open way up. They dilate so you can see what's going on because your life may depend on it. Okay, it inhibits salivary gland function. Salivary gland function is part of digestion, right? So forget about that, right? If your life is in danger, you're going to either have to fight or run away. I'm going to turn off all of these things, all of these functions that I don't care about, and if I survive, I'll turn them back on again. So I don't care about digesting my food if I'm running for my life. Right, when you're preparing to fight or flight, you inhibit the salivary gland function, and you basically divert blood away from the entire digestive system. Whereas when you're resting and digesting, the parasympathetic division, the salivary glands become activated. When you're resting and digesting, you constrict your pupils because you're not worried about what's going on around you. You don't have to see any things that are going to eat you, sneaking up on you from a dark area. It doesn't matter. Right? And it also relaxes the sympathetic division of the nervous system. It relaxes the lung bronchi, which allows more air to come in. It increases the heart rate. Do you remember which hormone causes the accelerated heart rate? Do you remember? I could very well ask you that on a test. It's epinephrine, remember? So epinephrine is the hormone that is involved in a lot of these functions. If the brain simply turns on the adrenal gland medulla and produces epinephrine, that will cause a lot of these things to happen. Okay, so as I said, blood is diverted away from the stomach and the digestive system. You can digest your food if you survive. If you don't survive, it doesn't matter either way. It inhibits the activity of the pancreas, which is also related to digestion, so forget about digesting your food. It stimulates glucose release from the liver because you need immediate energy. It stimulates the adrenal gland medulla, which we already discussed. It inhibits urination, and the sexual functions we don't need to talk about because we already. As it turns out, one of the things I didn't mention about the reproductive system is that it is related to the sexual reproduction function is part of the sympathetic division of the nervous system. All right, now. The opposite of all of this stuff happens if you're in the parasympathetic, if the parasympathetic division has been activated. Okay, so that is the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so to summarize the central nervous system, we have the meninges, which are the membranes surrounding the brain. The dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the pia mater. I told you what a subdural hematoma is and how serious it is. It's an emergency situation. We talked about the fact that the cerebral cortex is divided into two hemispheres, and the two hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum. I'm not sure we're not exactly sure whether the brain operates the same way when the two hemispheres are separated, has happened sometimes. Then each of the two hemispheres is divided into four lobes: the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Broca's area is responsible for formation of words. Wernicke's area is responsible for interpretation of words. We talked about the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex as well. We talked about the cerebellum being responsible for coordinating complicated movements. The diencephalon controlling the body mainly by the hypothalamus telling the pituitary gland to release different hormones. The limbic system responsible for aggression, as well as, more importantly, responsible for memory consolidation. Right? Brainstem responsible for rudimentary functions like heart rate and depth of breathing. The motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex we discussed, controlling the body, and the fact that the right half of the brain, the right hemisphere, controls the left side of the body and vice versa. Okay, summarizing the few things that we learned about the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system tends to consist of white matter neurons, and nerves that are outside the spinal cord. We know the difference between sensory neurons and the fact that particularly the skin sensory neurons divide the body into dermatones, and we talked about motor neurons that stimulate muscles. And then we talked about the divisions, the functional divisions between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, and the functional divisions of the autonomic nervous system being divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. Okay, so let's talk about part 3, which are pathologies of the nervous system. Okay, so in this part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about mood disorders and how mood disorders like depression can be cured by SSRI drugs. SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs. I'm going to talk about sciatica, which is a common problem causing severe pain in the legs and the lower back, and carpal tunnel syndrome, which causes pains in the hands if you're a typist or something like that, or somebody who's using a computer all day. These are both examples of compression neuropathies, meaning that you have a pinched nerve. Neurons, a lot of the peripheral neurons don't like to be compressed. They don't like to have pressure put on them. But those neurons happen to be running through parts of the body where you have muscles and tendons. And if those tendons in particular, if they become inflamed and they swell up, the swelling, if a neuron ends up being located between two tendons that are both swollen, that will put pressure or compression on the nerve. It will pinch the nerve. You might have heard the term pinched a nerve. And pinching a nerve or compressing a nerve generally causes pain, a sensation of pain. So sciatica and carpal tunnel syndrome are two examples of where you have inflamed muscle tendons that cause pinching of nerves and causing pain either in the leg or in the hand. We will also talk about some accidental brain injuries, such as frontal brain injury. This is where you're riding your bike and you fly over, your bike flips over and you hit your head on the pavement, damaging the frontal lobe of the brain, and it causes loss of executive functions. And that's why we wear helmets and things like that when we ride bicycles, why it's important to wear helmets when we're doing construction and so on. Spinal cord injury, which is often caused by traffic accidents or bicycle accidents or skiing accidents or skateboarding accidents. These are injuries to the cervical vertebra and sometimes other parts of the other vertebra in the back that cause you to lose control over your body below the area of the damaged vertebra. So if you have the cervical vertebra damaged in your neck, you could end up becoming a quadriplegic, which means you have no control over any of your body from the neck down. If you have damage to a lumbar vertebra or a thoracic vertebra, you could end up becoming a paraplegic, which means you're paralyzed from the waist down. So you have no control over your legs, but you can still breathe because you have control over your diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. Then we'll talk about 2 or 3 diseases that we believe have a genetic component, but we're not exactly sure what causes them. One is called multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease where your immune system attacks the myelin that is insulating the long neurons in your body, and it causes you to eventually lose the ability to control your body, which is quite tragic. Alzheimer's disease is a disease where you lose all of the memory from your brain. Basically, you revert to a childlike state. The neurotransmitters, the amount of neurotransmitters produced in your brain is severely cut back down to 5% of what it is under normal conditions. And so people in this sad situation, it generally hits people when they're in older age, like in their 50s and 60s or 70s. Is where you have the onset of Alzheimer's, a very tragic disease. And Parkinson's disease, which is loss of control over fine movements, which causes you to have uncontrollable tremors. You shake uncontrollably. You have trouble coordinating smooth movements. Like if you just want to reach your hand out and grab something, you can't do that without violently shaking back and forth. And so that's called Parkinson's disease. Multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's, we don't really know what the cause is, and so we don't really know how to fix it. We think those three diseases may have a genetic component as well as an environmental component. What that means is that there are a number of genetic diseases that are caused by a mutation in just one gene, and those are very easy to test for. Where you have a disease that has a genetic component, it means that there may be several different genes that combined cause this disease, and it's not a matter of having one mutant allele of a gene. It's a matter of having a certain combination of alleles of 50 or 100 different genes, and you have this unfortunate combination of 50 or 60 different alleles to 50 or 60 different genes that gives you a predisposition to getting this disease. But the disease is not only brought on by genetics or what genes you have, but it's also facilitated by what you do in your life and what you're exposed to. So you might be genetically predisposed to multiple sclerosis, but the full disease is not triggered unless you're exposed to a certain type of pesticide, for instance. All right, so let's start by looking at mood disorders and SSRI drugs. Okay, so I mentioned the fact that serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters, right? So there are several of them. But it just so happens that many of the neurons in our brain that are responsible for happy moods use serotonin as their neurotransmitter. So serotonin is used by many different types of neurons in the brain, but many of those neurons are responsible for making us feel happy. And people who are chronically depressed, chronic means a long-term illness, people who are chronically depressed, their brain doesn't make enough serotonin. Now, normally what happens when serotonin is produced, a neuron sends it out into the synapse, and it will stimulate another neuron, but you can't leave the serotonin in the synapse permanently because the other neuron that you're stimulating will be fired be firing permanently if you leave it there. So the neuron that produced the serotonin and put it into the synapse then takes it back. It's called reuptake of the serotonin, right? So serotonin reuptake. Once a neuron produces serotonin, puts it into the synapse and stimulates the next neuron rather, it then takes the serotonin back so that it can use it again. Okay, so somebody along the line thought, well, what if can we look for a drug that will prevent the neuron from taking the serotonin back? And the answer is yes. And we can prevent the neuron from taking the serotonin back, but that drug will not interfere with any of the other neurotransmitters, right? So those drugs that prevent the serotonin from being taken back by the neuron that created it, this has the effect of increasing the general overall level of serotonin in your brain, which contributes to a more happy feeling, a longer lasting happiness. Right, so people who are chronically depressed don't make enough serotonin. If you can prevent the serotonin from being taken back into the neurons, if you can prevent what little serotonin is produced from being taken back into the neurons, you can extend happy moods for these people. And that's what SSRI drugs are, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs, which prevent serotonin from being taken back up. Right? Prozac, for instance, is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. All right, sciatica and carpal tunnel syndrome. So when you compress a nerve or pinch a nerve, this is the case with many peripheral nerves, it gives a sensation of pain. When muscle tendons are inflamed because you've been abusing your muscles or you've been pushing, you've been putting pressure on them for some strange reason, when they become inflamed, they swell up, and this sometimes has the effect of pinching a nerve that's located in between them. All right, so sciatica is what happens if you have inflamed tendons in your legs that have the effect of pinching the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is a large nerve that runs down the backside, the posterior side of your leg. It's located underneath a lot of the other muscles in your leg, and it is susceptible to being pinched by swollen tendons. So you have pinching of the sciatic nerve, which is large nerve that's located in the posterior side of your leg underneath a few layers of muscle. If you have that nerve compressed, it will give you a constant pain in the leg or in the lower back, which is extremely unpleasant. And you feel this pain every time you move, basically, which is very unpleasant indeed. So what do you do about it? Well, there are a number of things you can do about it. You can try acupuncture. You can inject steroids. Remember that steroids will reduce the inflammation. Steroids reduce inflammation because inflammation is partly a function of the immune system. And remember that the corticosteroids, like cortisol, have the effect of suppressing the immune system. So if you suppress the immune system with steroid hormones, that will relieve the swelling of the tendons, and that will take the pressure off of the sciatic nerve or whichever nerve is being pinched. You can also take painkiller drugs. I have to say from personal experience that I had sciatica at one point in my life, and those painkillers were nearly useless. The painkillers are the least effective way to deal with sciatica. The best way to deal with sciatica is to keep active and to keep your body limber and to not abuse your body in such a way that you get swollen tendons rather. So massage, yoga, stretching, Pilates, massage, going to the chiropractor, these are all ways to prevent getting sciatica in the first place and to relieve sciatica. The best way to prevent sciatica, the best way to cure sciatica is not to get it in the first place. So you prevent getting sciatica by remaining limber and active by doing a lot of exercise activities, not exercise like you see in the gym where you see muscle-bound men lifting the same weights in the same pattern over and over again, but exercises and activities that stretch your tendons and keep them limber. All of those types of exercises will prevent you from getting things like sciatica. Carpal tunnel syndrome. Okay, so you know that the bones in your wrist are called the carpals. The wrist bones, the carpals, form a tunnel, a kind of a circular shape, and the tendons that operate the fingers in your hand run through the carpal tunnel, as well as a nerve called the median nerve. Right? So we have a median nerve that is used to feel sensation in your hand that runs through the carpal tunnel along with a bunch of tendons that operate your fingers. If you have swollen tendons inside the carpal tunnel, if they swell up, they will actually pinch the nerve that runs through the middle of them, basically, and you will feel pain in your hand. So here we have the carpal tunnel. There are the carpal bones around the back there. All of these things here are the tendons. And here we have something called the median nerve, which is right there. Right? And if those tendons swell up, they will compress the median nerve and cause pain in your hand. How does this normally happen? Like so. It usually happens as a result of poor typing posture. So if you're typing, you should have your hands in this position, what's called the neutral position. If your wrists are overextended, that causes a bit of tension in these tendons, and they may swell up. And worst of all, if you rest your wrists on the edge of your desk, this puts pressure on the tendons in the carpal tunnel and causes them to swell up the worst. So this on the far right, resting your wrists on the desk, is the worst possible thing you can do for carpal tunnel syndrome. So you should always type in this position to avoid carpal tunnel syndrome. If you get carpal tunnel syndrome, you can use pain suppressing drugs. That's the least effective method. Or you can do some prescribed exercises to your hands to try and keep your ligaments limber and flexible so that you don't get swollen ligaments and carpal tunnel syndrome. So another way you can do it is with steroid hormones like cortisol and so forth, yoga, acupuncture, any of those things. All right, now let's talk about frontal brain injury. Frontal brain injury is what you get when you have a blow to the front of your head. And what happens is basically if you have something hit the front of your head, your skull will be pushed backwards, but your brain, due to inertia, your brain is just kind of floating in a sea of cerebrospinal fluid. Your brain will not move backward as fast. So the skull will move back, the brain will move back slower, and that will cause the skull bone, the frontal skull bone, to hit the brain, the frontal lobe of the brain. And if this happens and it's serious, a serious blow to the front of your head, this can cause a loss. If it causes damage to the frontal lobe, it can cause a loss of executive functions, including a loss of your ability to control your temper, but a lot of other things, maybe loss of the ability to concentrate on things, possibly even loss of the ability to speak. Okay, that's one of the reasons why we wear bicycle helmets, and boxing is discouraged, and American football injuries can all cause damage to the frontal lobe. Right, so all of these things, in particular, boxing is particularly bad. It should be outlawed because it's not only because it's a barbaric sport, but because you're causing permanent damage to the brains of the athletes who participate in this sport. Now notice the bicycle helmet has this piece that sticks out. That is there so that piece will hit the pavement before your skull does. It would be bad if you turned the helmet around the other way, where your nose or your forehead would hit this pavement first. And notice that both the bicycle helmet and the construction helmet, they have straps on the inside, so that it's not just a piece of hard material that's protecting your skull. The straps, these kind of springy straps on the inside, are meant to absorb the blow so that the blow doesn't actually cause doesn't cause your skull or your brain to be rattled, right? So if you're in construction, make sure that the straps on the inside of your helmet are properly adjusted so that the helmet is kind of floating above your head. Because if it's not floating above your head, it's not doing its job. It's not enough just to have a hard layer of plastic protecting your skull. The hard layer of plastic will move when it's hit, right? And that's the idea. And the idea behind that is to avoid a frontal brain injury or any other type of a brain injury. All right, spinal cord injury. This is often caused by automobile accidents or skateboarding or skiing. Um, what you, to be honest, if you knew how fragile the human neck is, how fragile the human cervical vertebra is, you wouldn't do half the sports and half the activities that you do. If you knew how easily you could end up becoming a quadriplegic or a paraplegic by damaging your spinal cord. Nevertheless, you can't live in fear, but I will explain how this happens. So a paraplegic is somebody who had damage to some of the lower vertebra in their back, either the lumbar vertebra or the thoracic vertebra. And if you have damage to this vertebra causing compression of the neurons in the lower back, some of the neurons, but not all of them, may die as a result of the compression. And you end up being what's known as a paraplegic. A paraplegic is somebody who's paralyzed from the waist down, so they don't have control over their legs, basically. Sometimes they don't have control over their urination or defecation either. Okay, but you can move your arms, and you don't need a machine to breathe, so you can still breathe. That's a paraplegic, generally somebody who has a damage to a lumbar vertebra or a thoracic vertebra in the back. A quadriplegic is somebody who has damage to the cervical vertebra in the neck. Right, there are 7 of them, numbered C1 through C7. And we divide the quadriplegic into a low quad versus a high quad. If you have damage to the lower cervical vertebra, say C4 to C7, you may still be able to breathe without a machine called a ventilator. And you may have limited movement of your hands. Right, so that is called a low quad. A high quad, or high quadriplegic, is somebody who had damage to C1 through C4, the higher vertebra, and they have basically paralyzed from the neck down, no control over the hands or the arms, and probably has to breathe with a ventilator, a machine that is, so you would become a ventilator-dependent quadriplegic if you damage the cervical vertebra in your neck, the high ones, the C1 through C4. All right, so as I said, these types of injuries are often caused by automobile accidents. Now, notice that this crash test dummy here, they have a spring there this spring is meant to represent the 7 cervical vertebrae of the neck. And when they do these artificial car crashes, these artificial automobile accidents, what they're doing is they're trying to figure out if the cervical vertebra will become damaged. Now, you'll notice one thing here. Notice that there's a small gap of space between the cushion, the head cushion of the seat, and the skull. That is not supposed to be there, and that's usually what causes the most damage to the neck. So if you take away nothing from this course, one thing that you should do as a result of this course is that you should go home, and if you have a car, you should adjust the head cushion so that your head is almost touching it when you're driving. Because if somebody hits your car from behind and your head has to spring backwards before it hits the cushion, that will cause a neck injury, whiplash neck injury. So the idea behind the headrest of a car seat is that the headrest is supposed to prevent your head from springing backwards if you're hit from behind. If the head cushion is too far back, it can't do that. So most people are driving around today with the head cushion in their car improperly adjusted. So if you do nothing else, go out to your car and adjust the head cushion so that your head is basically touching it while you're driving. So that if somebody hits you from behind, your head will not move backwards, because that's what causes a cervical vertebra injury. All right, so let's, again, I'll show you some famous people who you may or may not know, and when you see them, you'll think about these different types of injuries, right? So a paraplegic is somebody who has a lumbar or a thoracic vertebra has been damaged, and they end up being paralyzed from the waist down, but they can still breathe without a machine, and they can still move their arms. All right, now this is one of Canada's heroes, right? So we should be aware of who Canada's heroes are if we're going to be good Canadians. In fact, most Canadians who were born here probably don't know who this guy is, but he is technically a famous Canadian. His name is Rick Hansen, and he sustained a lumbar vertebra damage in a car crash, but he was an athlete before that, and so he wanted to go on being an athlete afterwards. and so he became one of the world's famous wheelchair athletes. You can see he's operating his wheelchair by his hands, so he has no control over his legs, but he has lots of control over his arms and hands, and he doesn't breathe with a machine. And in the mid-1980s, Rick Hansen carried out something called the Man in Motion Tour, which is where he got people to donate money to him as he traveled around the world in his wheelchair. So he rolled his wheelchair around the entire world with people donating money to him, depending on how far he got. So he went all the way from Vancouver around the world back to Vancouver and raised millions and millions of dollars, which he then used to set up the Rick Hansen Foundation, which is a foundation that funds spinal cord injury research. So Rick Hansen is a hero. There's a building named after him in downtown Vancouver. You see statues of Rick Hansen around, so here's a statue. So that's an example of a paraplegic, somebody who's paralyzed from the waist down, has no control over his legs, but he's still able to breathe without a machine, and he has full control of his arms and hands. Now let's look at a low quad, somebody who was damaged at C4, C7, for instance. Okay, I'm not a huge fan of this guy's philosophy. You may recognize him or you may not. He's actually dead now, but he was quite a famous opinion columnist. He was a syndicated newspaper opinion columnist who wrote opinions in newspapers all over the world. His name was Charles Krauthammer, and I disagreed with almost everything he ever said. But you can disagree with somebody's philosophy and still admire the person. And he was a low quad, and so he's in a wheelchair. But he doesn't need a machine to breathe during the day. But when you go to sleep, he uses a ventilator. So because when you're concentrating on your breathing when you're awake, you can breathe. But then when you have to rely on your unconscious to your brainstem to operate your lungs, then you need a machine. So Charles Krauthammer needed a ventilator to sleep, but he did have some control over his hands, so he controlled he had an electric wheelchair, not a manual wheelchair like Rick Hansen had, and he could control the electric wheelchair with a joystick, and he could also drive, which is kind of interesting. So here he's driving his car. He has no control over his feet, so he can't control the pedals, but he has kind of he's controlling basically the steering wheel with his left hand. He steers the car with this left control, and then he controls the speed with this accelerator that's in his right hand. Right? So he could drive. He had no control over his feet, but he could still drive a car. So that is a low quad. And he sustained his injury because he dove into a swimming pool at the shallow end and hit his head on the way down. And so that's a very common way for quadriplegics to sustain their injury, is to dive into a body of water head first without knowing how deep it is. So be very careful when you're swimming. So Charles Krauthammer dove in headfirst into a swimming pool without knowing how deep it was, and he hit the top of his head on the bottom of the swimming pool, and that essentially broke the neck, basically. So that's a very common way to become a quadriplegic, is by diving into a pool or to a pond. All right, high quad. Now, you may not know who this actor is, but he was a very famous actor when I was a teenager. His name was Christopher Reeves, and he played the original Superman in the original Superman movie in 1978. Unlike the modern Superman characters that have a plastic chest with fake muscles on it, Christopher Reeve that's actually his real body. He was quite athletic looking, and he was a very famous actor. He was a heartthrob for the women. The ladies loved him and everything. And he was very, very athletic and so on. And he liked equestrian sports. He liked to steeplechase with horses. And one day he was steeplechasing. He was, where the horse jumps over a gate as part of a race. And the horse refused. The horse ran up to the thing that it was supposed to jump over and then stopped. And Christopher Reeves flew head over heels and landed on his head on the ground on the other side, breaking his neck at the C2 level. And so he ended up looking like this for the rest of his life. So you see here, he has a tube that is allowing him to breathe because he has no control over his diaphragm. He's a C2 high quad, a C2 quadriplegic. He's controlling the wheelchair with his tongue. There's a radio-controlled plate that he wore on the roof of his mouth that he could control with his tongue and drive the wheelchair. But he could not move anything below the neck. So he was paralyzed from the neck down. He breathed with a ventilator. So that tube that's going into his neck is feeding air into his lungs. And so that Christopher Reeves was an example of a high quad. Okay, now if you have damage to the back or to the cervical vertebra, the treatment is something called traction and stabilization. So what they do is they drill some holes into your skull and they put in some rods, and then they put some weight onto the end of a string that's attached to these rods to basically stretch your neck back out. So your neck has been compressed, and then they try to pull it back out. And if you can do that if you can get somebody who's sustained that kind of an injury, you get them to the hospital on time and get them into traction within an hour, ideally as much shorter than an hour as you can manage. If you can get them into the hospital into traction in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that would be even better. But up to an hour, you may be able to reverse some of that neural damage, and they call that the golden hour. That if you can get somebody who's had that kind of an injury into traction in under an hour, the shorter the better, you may be able to relieve some of that damage, and they wouldn't have to go through the rest of their life as a quadriplegic. All right, so that is spinal cord injury, SCI, a very common injury. And then these other ones, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's disease. Okay, multiple sclerosis is where the body's immune system attacks the myelin of the neurons, and this eventually causes you to lose control over all the parts of your body. It's a very tragic, heartbreaking illness. It seems to run in families. It's more common in people whose ancestors came from the Northern Europe, Norway, Sweden, Russia in particular. But obviously everybody whose ancestors came from Norway, Sweden, Russia doesn't get multiple sclerosis. There are a lot of people from South America who get it as well, other places. So we think that it has something to do with combinations of gene alleles plus environmental factors. This is an actress named Annette Funicello, who is a very famous heartthrob actress when I was a child. She's probably the most famous person in the Western world who had multiple sclerosis. People watched her deteriorate as she got older, going from a perfectly healthy young woman to a wheelchair-bound woman, and then eventually she lost control of all of her body. She couldn't speak, she couldn't swallow, she couldn't move her eyes, and eventually she died. Very tragic death. So multiple sclerosis is what killed Annette Funicello, very sadly. Alzheimer's disease, you lose all of your memory. Basically, you revert to being a child without any memories or experiences. They look at people who have Alzheimer's disease and they find that like 95% of the brain's acetylcholine production has been eliminated, so their brain is only producing about 5% as much acetylcholine as it was. We don't know the cause. It might have a genetic component. There's no unknown cause, unknown cure. Probably the most famous person who ever suffered from Alzheimer's disease was Ronald Reagan, who was president of the United States in the 1980s, from 1980 to 1988. This is him here signing a peace treaty with Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev. So there's Reagan over there. As soon as Reagan left, he left office as president in 1989. He started to show signs of Alzheimer's disease. A few years later, Alzheimer's disease generally strikes people when they're in their 60s or 70s. A few years later, he didn't remember anything about being president. He didn't recognize or remember any of his family members, eventually lost the ability to speak. So that's probably the most famous person ever to die of Alzheimer's. Parkinson's disease, you lose control over fine motor movements. You shake uncontrollably. You end up having holes in the brain called lesions, particularly down by the cerebellum and some of the areas around the cerebellum. The cause is unknown and the treatment is unknown. There's no cure. There are some treatments that can diminish the tremors. Tremors mean shaking. So people who have advanced Parkinson's disease tend to shake uncontrollably, and there's some drugs that you can take that where you can kind of lessen the shaking. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember this actor, but he's one of Canada's most famous actors, and he's also one of the most famous people in the West to suffer from Parkinson's disease. His name is Michael J. Fox. He was in a movie in 1985 called Back to the Future. He's also from Vancouver, by the way. He grew up in Burnaby, and so he was a very famous actor in the 1980s. This was his most famous movie. When he got into his 30s and 40s, he started to have the shakes, and he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Now, if you see him, he takes a lot of medications to control the shaking, but if he doesn't take the medications, he is constantly shaking because you have no ability to kind of fine tune the movements of your body. You're constantly shaking back and forth. You can't eat because if you put anything in a spoon, you'll end up throwing it in the air instead of putting it in your mouth. Somebody has to feed you, put food in your mouth for you, and it's very tragic. All right, so these were the pathologies of the nervous system that we discussed. And this is the vocabulary for this week. The only thing that I haven't talked about that's on this vocabulary is ventricle. Don't worry about that word. I won't ask you about it. But there are certain pockets inside the cerebrum that contain cerebrospinal fluid that are called ventricles. Don't worry about that. Refractory period refers to when a neuron depolarizes, it needs a few minutes to pump the sodium back out and the potassium back in. During that period, called the refractory period, the neuron cannot be stimulated again. So that's what a refractory period is. Everything else I think I discussed. So this was the final lecture, and good luck in the final exam. And I hope to see you possibly again in another course.